Well, let the record show in this COVID crisis, it was the National Hockey League that was the first pro sports organization in North America to say we are coming back, as we welcome in our insiders, Chris Johnston and Elliotte Friedman from the NHL on Sportsnet and Hockey Night in Canada. We knew it was going to be a 24-team format, fellas, but to have Gary Bettman and then subsequently Bill Daly, the deputy commissioner, basically outline the entire system that they have in place. They have a lot of it ready to rock, but there are still some question marks as they move ahead towards the summer.
Well, there certainly are. You know, what stood out to me, Arash, really was just how open they were. You know, that they gave timelines, even if they are still the sketches of a timeline, you know, things even like Gary Bettman saying it's going to be 3 weeks or so till he has to decide, you know, between which the two hub cities are. You know, they provided a timeline beyond just the small group workouts in terms of getting training camps up and running in the first half of July and hoping that that will then progress to games by the end of July or the start of August. I think that, you know, they were able to fill in some of the gaps and, you know, maybe in showing us so much, remove some of the question about how are they going to do this. I mean, so much of the last 11 weeks has centered on how can they pull it off? What will happen if a player tests positive? You know, in a series of interviews that they did on this on Tuesday, I think that they at least showed us why they think it can happen and kind of paved the way for it to happen.
Yeah, testing is such an important part of all this, and it was NHLPA Executive Director Don Fehr on Tim and Sid who said, look, testing is the one area that there is no compromising on, and Elliotte, it was Bettman who said, look, expect 25 to 30,000 COVID-19 tests over the course of this NHL playoff tournament.
Well, the economics of this are pretty interesting because, as he said, that's going to cost them millions. And he was asked later how much it was going to cost the league to do the whole thing. And the answer was tens of millions. And that is one thing that I think has been kind of discussed behind the scenes is you could make a real argument there isn't the economics in the short term are it's short-term pain for long-term gain is what they're looking at here. I don't think there's any question about that. You know, I thought the day was really interesting. I thought they were smart not to give dates because the moment you give a date, you don't hit it. People are like, oh, this is a disaster and It's not going to happen. So I didn't have a huge problem with that. I thought it was really interesting that for the first time, after quietly a lot of people saying we're going to work out our issues with the Canadian border, now there's an admission the Canadian border is a problem. And the other thing I thought was, you know, I had to tell you, CJ and Arash, when I was trying to do some research on the draft lottery, guys were telling me this is really confusing. Like I've just seen it a couple of times and I don't know what it is. And when they explained it today, it actually made a lot of sense. I thought I was going to hate it. And I said, you know, it makes a lot of sense the way they're going to do it. So I think there's a lot of questions to answer, but you know, I do think that what they announced to come back to, obviously there's still a few things that have to get discussed, but it made a lot of sense to me.
On the dates, Bettman said, look, we'd just be guessing if we announced anything. He said, we're not going down that road. Elliotte, you mentioned the border. Bill Daly said this on a media call. This was his quote. We won't be in a position to use the Canadian cities as a hub city, close quote, if the 14-day quarantine remains in place. Mm-hmm. The three Canadian cities in question are Vancouver, Edmonton, and Toronto, and BC's Minister of Health came out on Tuesday and said it's a non-starter, that we are maintaining that 14-day quarantine. So if that remains the case, and who knows what's going to unfold over the next 3 weeks, this, I suppose, on the surface becomes now a two-horse race between Edmonton and Toronto.
No, I don't think so, Arash. I think if the border doesn't change, it's a no-horse race and they're not coming to Canada. Like, I do think that people have discussed that there is I don't want to say, I don't like the words responsibility and moral obligation because I think it just sounds so
pretentious.
Pretentious. Thank you, Chris.
I don't think responsibility is pretentious, though, Elliotte.
No, I don't think, because I don't think there's necessarily, the only responsibility they have is to go to the safest place. To me, that's the responsibility. If you're going to play, go to the safest place. That's the only responsibility you have.
Edmonton might be the safest place based on the COVID tests.
It might be, but if I was a player crossing the border and I already know I might have to spend time away from my family, or my family is going to be quarantined with me, I might not want to do 14 extra days. So what I'm trying to say is that I do think they'd like to play in Canada. I do. I think both sides have discussed that Canada is a big part of hockey, and if we can go there, and we will go there. But that 14-day thing, I think for the players, it's a non-starter. And, you know, the commissioner talked about one for the East and one for the West. This has already changed from 4 hubs down to 2. I think at the end of the day, I don't care if both cities are West. Go to 2 cities that are safe and make sense.
I thought it was interesting when we talk about the economics of this. Donald Fear, again, he was on with Tim and Sid. He said, our great uncertainty is not this season. He said, we know that revenue decline. He said, what we don't know is next year or the year after. And he said, we have to reach agreements anticipating what is ahead and basically settle on some provisions that everybody can live with. You know, I think so many sports fans, and we're 10, 11 weeks into this entire pandemic, people are so anxious to just get back to any kind of normalcy. The important part to remember here that it's not just about the summer of 2020. What's happening now is going to have implications on next season and beyond.
Well, sure. I mean, the ultimate reality is the league had played 85% of the regular season when it was paused. I mean, most of the revenues for this year, 2019-20, that is, were locked in from an NHL perspective. Obviously, there's still loss in this, but it's not nearly as bad as, say, a sport like baseball, which is trying to get its season off the ground at a time that this is happening. I think, one of the great stories from an NHL perspective with this comeback has been how seamless it's gone between the owners and the players. I think there has been legitimately a lot of pulling the rope in the same direction, realizing that they can be stronger together, that they've been looking to find mutual solutions. But kind of underpinning all of it is the fact that this sport needs a new CBA, that an extension is on the horizon. I think some low-level talks have kind of been had throughout the process of this. And those, I expect, Arash, will be tied to those future seasons. I mean, players are facing the possibility that, they're handing back 30% of their contracts next year or the year after, depending on what happens with the revenues in the league. And so, I can understand where Donald Fear is coming from and making that statement because, yes, I mean, there's sort of the triage of the moment to get through. As Elliotte said, the short-term pain, you're trying to get the sport back up and running to become, the kind of business it was before the pandemic arrived. But, I think some of this will be worked out at the negotiating table, whether the league allows the players maybe to absorb the losses over a period of time rather than just 1 season or 2 seasons paying big escrow. So, there's still, I guess, as much as they've got along to this point, I think there's still the potential there for a battle at some point here in the future.
There's a lot of work to do.
One thing they have agreed on, guys, is that they're going to be expanded rosters for this playoff format. I know that we talked earlier about the dates. I think anybody watching this wants to know, when am I going to have hockey on my television?
Well, I think I've always believed if they can, they will do it at the end of July. If you take a look at NBC, their Olympic window was last week of July, first week of August. And I really do believe that in a perfect world, that is when they would play. We're just not living in a perfect world. I mean, I hope we see it. I'd love to watch hockey. I'd love to watch sports of anything. I really hope we see it. But CJ, that's kind of when I think they would like to do it if they can.
Well, and look, you're talking about 2 months from today when we're talking. I mean, obviously some players have skated during the pause. More guys have been able to do it in recent weeks with some of the local restrictions where they're based being eased. Hopefully the facilities will be open in NHL cities as of next week. I mean, that's a long time for players at least to get back up and skating and get their conditioning back. And I thought one interesting part that Gary Bettman mentioned today was that they are going to totally leave this in the hands of the players. I mean, right now it's contemplated you're looking at a 3-week training camp, give or take. But if the players get back and say we don't need that long, maybe it gets shortened to 2 weeks, the league's willing to do that. And so, you know, a lot of this is going to depend on obviously getting people back in place, getting them in a position to be working out and skating again. But, you know, I do think that there's a window there and an opportunity to start games by the end of July. And you know, they'd like to get the Stanley Cup handed out in September because, and no one wants to talk about this, that the second wave medically is hanging out there as a possibility. And I think the league recognizes this could be a window to get this tournament done before we're dealing with the effects of this in a meaningful way again in the fall.
And Gary Bettman ensured that next season will happen in full if there are no other medical issues. A 24-team playoff tournament, 2 hub cities to determine the Stanley Cup champion in 2020. With our insiders, that's Chris Johnston and Elliotte Friedman.